And we will go. Hello, welcome to another Maryland STEM Festival event. This afternoon we have a special guest. We have Professor Scott Metcalf who will be talking about sound and recording sound. It's obvious that technology has become very critical to the recording and producing of sound, and even more so now that we're dealing with the COVID pandemic. So Professor Metcalf will be talking to us about capturing your instrument at home with a microphone, which home recording and home broadcasting is becoming all the rage right now. So I will turn it over to Professor Metcalf to begin his program. Thank you, Professor Metcalf.
Yes, sir. Thanks very much. And thanks for having me here. I'm in my home studio in Severna Park, Maryland. I normally teach up at the Peabody Conservatory in Baltimore. But like most students and most teachers, we're working from home and making the best of it. And one of the things that has become clear over the past several months is how a lot of people need some guidance on how to make their instrument sound good when they're working at home, either connecting with a teacher for a lesson or playing music live, or even something pre or post COVID related where you just want to record yourself and get a decent sound capture of your instrument or of your voice. So I put together some slides here to give you some ideas, and I have some examples that I think what I may do is make them available to you afterwards on the web so that you can go at your convenience and play back at a higher quality than might be possible in this format. So let me jump over to some slides here, and we'll take a look at some of these concepts. We'll be talking about some things like how sound moves in a space, but also how we hear sound. So a little bit of biology, if you will, mixed in with some basic physics ideas as well. So I've got this picture here that shows maybe a typical nice apartment that a student might live in with some roommates up at, I actually took this picture from a website I found near the Johns Hopkins campus where Peabody is situated. And this is an example of an apartment off campus where students might live. And it looks like a really nice place to be in, although just looking at it right now, I'm seeing a lot of things that might be problematic about making a recording in there. What's interesting is what sounds good to us when we're in the room doesn't always make the best recording tool. And that has a lot to do with how our ears are far more sophisticated than even our really good quality microphones. So I've got this little diagram here showing that the microphone would have a little trouble with this room the way it is right now. Our ear would have no trouble with it at all. So let's see why that is. So just a very simple overview of how the ear works. On the outside of our hearing system, if you will, is our pinna. And the pinna kind of scoops in energy as it's coming past us. It helps us hear, we would say binaurally, but you might think about it as being stereophonic, that we can hear left and right in a sense of depth and so forth. So that energy gets scooped in here, funneled down the ear canal, and then through the eardrum, which is an awful lot like the diaphragm that's in my microphone right here. The diaphragm or the eardrum, the medical term for it is the tympanum as it's labeled here. That'll vibrate given the changes in air pressure that are funneling into our ear canals. And then that's connected to these three bones in the middle ear, labeled here as the malleus, incus, and stapes, or stapes. I've heard it pronounced both ways. So you may be more familiar with the terms hammer, anvil, and stirrup, given the way the shapes as they appear. And those are actually an amplifier. And what's really interesting is I have a diaphragm right here on the microphone that's a whole lot like my eardrum. And this portion of the microphone actually contains what we call a preamplifier, but it's an amplifier very much like the amplifier that is inside all of our ears. So it takes the little tiny vibrations from the microphone, sends it through those three bones, amplifies it, and then brings it into the cochlea. And in a lot of ways, this is where kind of the magic starts to happen. So what'll happen is the little vibrations that are magnified, but still pretty small, those vibrations are being sent through this thing. It looks kind of like a snail here. Those vibrations are being sent through here. I'll show you in the next slide a little bit more detail on that. And inside the cochlea, there's a lot of information that's dissected, if you will, about the sound as it was coming in, and sends that along this auditory nerve into the brain. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. So we've kind of split apart our sound into a whole bunch of different components, sent it through different channels, different nerves, nerve endings through the auditory nerve into the brain. The brain makes sense of it based on what you're thinking of, what you're focused on, maybe what you're seeing, goes back to the cochlea and says, give me more of this, give me less of this, sends it back to the brain. So for example, if you're sitting there listening to me, you may not be noticing that there's somebody in another room that's making noise, or a pet is barking or meowing, or you hear a truck go by outside. And now that I've said it, you can probably shift your focus and notice that a car just went by or something else happened. So we're really good at tuning into things that we want to hear. We're also pretty good at tuning out things that we don't want to hear, whether we should be listening to it or not. That's something that microphones can't do. And that's a big key here to learning how to use a mic properly in a space where we're going to be doing a record. So here is a diagram of the what's happening inside the cochlea. We have this thing in here called the basilar membrane. So if we took this swirly part here and laid it out flat, basically what's happening is right where the stapes is connected here, the highest frequencies are being picked up. So the really, really high frequencies, like you might joke that only dogs can hear. That's the top end of our hearing range up here. Easy numbers are 20,000 hertz, although everybody's different. And as you get older and depending on exposure, you lose some of those high frequencies. The low frequencies go all the way through here, so that the lowest like bass notes that you would hear are coming all the way at the end of this. And all along the inside of this membrane, there are tiny little hair cells called cilia. And there's basically one hair cell for every single frequency that's trying to get picked up and sent to your brain. So they estimate that, you hear different numbers, but usually around 30,000 little hairs that are connected to nerve endings that send that signal to the brain, so the brain can interpret all this information, then send its requests, if you will, back to the cochlea and say, okay, turn these ones down, turn these ones up. I want to focus more on this information and less on that information. So it's kind of a two-way process back and forth between the brain and what's happening in the ear, whereas my microphone, so that if my ear has 30,000 outputs, this microphone's only got one output. There's one cable coming out of this. So all of those frequencies are being shoved together into one stream and being sent into my digital workstation or my recording device. So we have to be the brains for our microphones. We have to think about what are the things that we don't want to hear and what are the things that we want to hear, and find a way of balancing between those two to get something that we think resembles what we personally subjectively think it should sound like. And in some ways, that's where a lot of the art and the craft comes into recording. There's a lot of science into how this thing works, into understanding how our ears work. But then there's the subjective artistic side of it, which is to say, well, if something is more classical, we might mic it in a way that takes into account more of the performance space, for example, or blends an ensemble nicely, versus something maybe that's more pop music or rock and roll, where we want to get a lot closer to it and we want to get a lot more detail out of it, and something that's maybe a little bit more hyped than what you would hear if you were in the same room with that source. So if we go back into this room for a second, and I mentioned again that our ear is going to do okay in here, the mic's not going to do so well. Why is the mic not going to do so well? Well, just looking at this, I can see there's a lot of places where that violin is going to bounce around the room. And our ears are going to say, well, I just don't want to listen to those bounces around the room. I want to listen to what's coming from the violin. And maybe I'll bring in some of this stuff to to help me hear the space, but I can focus more on what's coming directly from the violin. If there's any noise out here on the street, this is taken in Baltimore, so there's probably noise on the street. You know, your ear probably is going to tune that out pretty well, unless for some reason you want to focus on that. The microphone is just going to merge all this information together and send it down that one cable. Everything's going to be mixed together, and that's what you're going to end up with. So how you resolve that, there could be done in several different ways. One of the first things that I like to do if I'm going to be recording in a small room is try to put a lot of soft stuff up in there. So in this graphic, you can see we've put like a curtain or a divider up here that's blocking the reflector or the reflection off this wall. I'm a sound guy, so you might want to do something more visually aesthetically pleasing than what I came up with, but you know, maybe hanging a tapestry or something up there, something just to break up the reflections off that wall, soak some of that up. Putting some area rugs on the floor, maybe putting a heavier curtain rather than that sheer curtain. Here's a little tip, if you can see light through a fabric, most of the sound is getting through it as well. So the more it's going to block the light, the more it's going to block, especially the higher frequencies that if we look at the physics of it, if you will, when we have a really high frequency, it means we've got to have a lot of wave cycles in the same amount of time that a low frequency would be. So the high frequencies have very, very short wavelengths, whereas the low frequencies have much, much longer. We can hear wavelengths that are, 15 feet or more, and we can hear wavelengths that are, well under an inch. So there's a pretty big range of wavelengths that we might need to deal with, both in terms of soaking the room and in how we apply other things like microphone placement and so forth. We've also got a nice sofa here, which was there before, so that's going to help us a bit too. You've probably noticed when you've gone into a room that maybe you're moving into a new house apartment and there's no furniture in there yet, no rugs. It sounds really different compared to what it sounds like when you finally got your stuff moved in. That's kind of an extreme example of what I'm describing here. The sound is much more focused, even to our own ears, when we do some of this kind of stuff. And for microphones, the farther we can go with this in general, the better. If you're in a big concert hall, it's different. The microphones and our brains, we do a better job sort of reconciling all that information because it's taking longer to come back. It's when we're in a small room, like a studio or a home, living room or bedroom, where it becomes harder to reconcile those reflections, and it's better to just kind of get rid of as many of them as you can. So, oops, jumped ahead a couple too many here. So let me go back. Yeah, so here we are with our, so placing the microphone within arm reach will also minimize how much the room is captured. So we think about, if you have a mic over in this area, it's going to be a little bit too far away, but you swing it in a little bit closer, say in this area, you have to use your judgment to decide when it's too close, but you'll find a balance where you're hearing more of the instrument that you're looking for and less of the room bouncing around it. I'll put this up in the slides that I share as well, but this is just showing the certain instruments. So if you play a string instrument, this is showing violins and violas are kind of grouped together here, and then the cellos are along here. And it's showing the range of frequencies that typically emit from the instrument in a direction that's going to be fairly common across all of the instruments. So in this case, the 2000 to 5000, which is really, that's kind of the main articulation of a sound. That's kind of spread out across the top of the violin and probably is blocked by the player's body a bit. So if you get around behind them or too far over here, you're going to be losing some of that. You do notice, though, that how all of the frequencies have this common spot where it's like right off the face of the instrument. For the most part, that's true with the cello as well. So typically coming in straight on these instruments is going to give you the widest frequency response anyway from your microphone from what the instrument is putting out. Also in these slides, I've got a handy chart that I put together that shows the musical scale. So if you're a musician and you're more familiar with a piano keyboard or where the notes reside on a scale, I've translated that here so you can see when we're up at like 2000 or 4000 hertz that I was showing you on the other chart. This is really high. This is way up in the ledger line zones. And then way down here at 32, almost to the bottom of our hearing system, is where we get down to the very bottom of the piano. So that might be helpful. And for those of you that are not pianists but play an orchestral instrument, this is a chart that does the same thing. So shows, well, vocals here. I mentioned the instruments, but here's vocals. Here's where a guitar fundamental tends to land, bass fundamentals, drum set, and then the orchestral instruments up here at the top. So that could be helpful when you're trying to figure out what these things mean. Woodwind instruments are really tricky. So if you play a woodwind instrument, one of the things that makes a woodwind instrument really open up and sound really beautiful is when you're in a big enough room for that sound to develop. If you get up really close to somebody playing a flute or a clarinet or an oboe or a bassoon, what you're going to notice is if you move your head around the instrument, you're going to hear spots where some frequencies are more dominant and some are less so. And that same thing is going to happen with a microphone, just like it does with our ears. So woodwind instruments tend to need a little bit of space away from it to get kind of a culmination of those different sounds that are coming out of it. Another good tip is you'll notice that where the bell is, if you will, or the opening of the instrument at the end of its cylinder, you'll notice that that's really high frequency. Look at the flute, 8,000 hertz. That's really, really high. Coming out of the bottom of the clarinet and oboe, 5,000 hertz, really high stuff. The end of a bassoon, 5,000 and above is what we're assuming by that. That's not the most pleasant thing to listen to. So you may see people miking a trombone or a trumpet by putting a mic on the other side of it. That kind of makes sense because most of the sound of that instrument is coming out there. But woodwinds, that's kind of the last place you want to mic a woodwind instrument. You don't want to mic a clarinet in the hole. Saxophone, sometimes we do. It's a little bit of a different character. But if you mic a clarinet or an oboe or a bassoon there, I don't think you're going to be happy with the sound. It's very bright, very brittle sounding. So we tend to try to go for the sides of it where we're getting a little bit more of the blend of all of those frequencies together. So this is just articulating that again. So one of the ideas would be with a flute, for example, you often see on TV, like more pop styles, where they'll mic near the performer's face. You know, again, there's a lot of different sounds coming out of that whole instrument. So you don't want to go off the end of it. That does not sound very good, but just about anywhere along the sides of it is fair game. And where the right position is up to your ears. So play with that, aim it, you know, play with the distance a little bit, but somewhere along that range, closer you get to the mouth, the more sort of embouchure noise that you're getting, that's maybe a little bit more pop sounding, if that's what you're going for. Getting further away from that gives you more of the tone of the instrument and less of that articulation. Again, with a bassoon, so sort of the midsection of the instrument, getting maybe a little bit cheated towards the top end, so you get a little bit of that detail out of there, but avoiding this this angle right off the top of it. Brass instruments are a little bit more straightforward, so to speak. I guess the French horn wouldn't count because the French horn goes the other direction, but the trumpet and the trombone and the tuba, they're pretty much going to be all of the tone straight out of the instrument. So as you go towards the edge, you might notice that it gets a little bit brighter because some of those frequencies kind of get bent or diffracted out the sides a little bit. But once you go past the bell, it gets very dull because you're losing all those high frequencies. The French horn and the tuba, of course, can be tricky because they're not aimed at the listener. So if you put a mic there, it'll work, but it's not going to sound like you expect the instrument to. So we tend to try to find a place where it's a little bit more off axis, a little bit more of that fuller tone that wouldn't have been right for a trombone and a trumpet, but would be right for the French horn or for the tuba in this case. And singers, not going to leave the singers out. With a classical singer, a good suggestion is to get about an arm's length away. You don't want to be really close to a sensitive microphone as a classical singer. It's not that it's bad for the microphone. Most modern microphones are going to handle as loud as you want to try to sing. You're not going to damage it. But it's more the quality of it. It's more of a pop or a Broadway or more of a contemporary sound when you're really close to the microphone. For a classical voice, you're looking for a little bit more space, the sort of sound of the overtones and so forth that are coming off the head and coming out of the mouth, and giving that sound a chance to develop a little bit before you pick it up. With pop vocals, you do tend to want to be closer. There's a lot of subjectivity in how close you want to get. Typically, you're going to want some kind of pop filter or windscreen on the microphone. A trick that I've seen a lot of people use that's at least a good place to start is to stretch your thumb and your pinky finger out and come up with a distance between your mouth and the microphone. And that's going to be a pretty good starting place. You may find you want to get closer for some styles, or even a little bit, further away for others. Right? As far as the tools that you could use for doing this capture, it wasn't that long ago that a microphone that you plugged into your computer wasn't usually a very good microphone. But I'm happy to say that that's changed a lot. And it was somewhat to my surprise when we all started going into quarantine earlier in the spring, that a lot of musicians were contacting me and saying, hey, I see these USB microphones. Are they any good? And so I got a few sent to me that I could demo, and there were several that I tried that I was very impressed with. These were two in particular, one from Audio-Technica, and this other LYRA, I think it's Lyra or Lyra, I'm not sure how they say it, from AKG. This mic will do stereo recording. So if you're recording a bigger instrument or an ensemble, a bigger instrument like a piano, AKG's Lyra microphone would do a really nice job. If you're just recording a single instrument and you're in a small room, I think just a standard sort of monophonic microphone like this Audio-Technica can be a really good choice. So those are ones that you don't already have an interface, and you want to just have something that you can plug right into your computer, or even one of the new iPads that has a USB-C port on it, or an Android-based tablet that has USB-C. A lot of these microphones can plug right into there. I should say even the phones that have that, or you have some kind of adapter to get to it, you can actually put these mics right there. Another alternative, especially if you'd like flexibility of using more microphones and doing more things with this, perhaps other than just recording at home, is to find yourself a nice little USB interface that you can hook up also to any of those devices, a portable device or your computer. And then you can plug any conventional microphone. This one you can see has what we call an XLR connector coming out of it. It's not a USB connection. And getting most professional microphones, if not all professional microphones, have an XLR output. So getting an interface that has that connection available just gives you a lot of options for microphones that would work with that. All right. So the next page I'm going to show you is a microphone company. These guys make some really high-end microphones that we use in the recording studio. They're used in live sound. Quite often you'll see their microphones used in broadcast for sports, with the microphones that come over the ear and out to the side. There's a few companies that make those. They're one of them. DPA, Danish Pro Audio, and they have a website called, it's part of their website. It's dpamicrophones.com, and they have a section called Mic University. So for those of you that I've piqued your interest today in how microphones work, you can go a lot deeper into how they work in the Mic University. You can also see a lot of examples of how to mic instruments, some that are very common and familiar to you, like a grand piano, or something that's maybe much less familiar to you, like a Western harp or a Chinese harp, and other instruments that you might have not thought about how you might want to reproduce those. A caveat is, of course, because it's on their website, all of the microphones they're using are all of their microphones. Their microphones are great. We have several of them up at Peabody. I have some here in my mic closet in my studio, so that's great. But they're expensive. They're high-end professional microphones. But really, what they're describing can be done with any comparable microphone. There's a lot of microphones out there that are really good, that are much more affordable than the DPAs for the hobbyist and for the home recording musician. This next page, I did a recording with my son in our house where I took a pair of microphones, and I did 3 different positions with this. As I mentioned earlier, this I think is going to be more effective for you to listen to on a website later, so I'm not going to play it for you right now. But if you're interested, let us know and we'll get you that link information. But if you kind of make out in this picture here, what we did on the first recording, if you can imagine back to those photos that I started with, this in my living room here, I've taken the rug that we normally have set up. You can see it set up down here, and we rolled it back to the piano. We didn't take it away completely because one of the legs of the piano is on top of it, and I didn't feel like moving the piano. And we put the microphone on the other side of the room, or the 2 microphones in the other side of the room, and we recorded the piano from there. And it didn't sound bad, but it has that characteristic I was describing to you, where the microphones are really, they're picking up everything. You know, there's a sofa in there, a couple of soft chairs, but there's a lot of walls. There's a hard floor now that's not covered. And the piano sounds a little bit kind of nebulous. It doesn't sound very focused. So our next step was doing a recording where we roll the rug back in, kept the microphones as close as we could to the same spot, although I think I had to cheat a little bit and move it when I rolled the carpet back, but it's close enough to get the point across. And just doing that, you notice that there's more focus in the sound. You're getting less of that early reflection, we call it, coming off the floor. You still have the ceiling, you still have the side walls. Behind the microphones, there's a bookcase, so that's helping break some of it up. It's not so much a problem. And then the last version of this, still with a rug in place, is we just moved the mic stand about half the distance in. So we got it closer to the piano, therefore capturing more of the instrument itself and less of the reflections that are bouncing around the room. So if you're interested in checking this out, look for the link soon, and you'll be able to hear it for yourself. You might find, if you're listening on your computer speakers or a tablet or your phone, that the details are hard to pick up. So if possible, wear a good set of earbuds or headphones so that you can hear more of what I'm talking about there. So to just kind of wrap this up in some conclusions here, if you're working in a small room, it may sound really good to your ears, but it may not sound so great to the microphones and what ultimately gets captured. And again, that's not necessarily a problem with the microphone. It's that once the microphone has merged all of that information that it's picking up around the room into a single stream, our brains now don't really have much of a chance to put that together and make anything out of it. When I'm in a room with just myself, without headphones on, without a microphone, my brain knows that all these sounds are coming from different directions, and I can focus in on the direction that I'm most interested in and the sound that I'm most interested in. The mic just can't do that. So we've got to do things that are going to give the mic a better chance of picking up what we want to hear. So adding these soft materials in that are going to help attenuate or soften some of those higher frequencies, especially maybe some of the mid frequencies that are just going to give us a little bit more focus to the sound. Wait for the next slide to come up here. There we go. An experiment with mic placement. So here we got the microphone in place finally, and you may start with it further away and then pull it in a little bit closer. And this is the point where you're kind of using the the charts that I showed you as to where the sound's coming out of the instrument, but also subjectively, what do you like? What's the sound that you like? This musician here is playing violin. If he's playing something classical, you might want it where the stand is, or maybe even a little further away. If he's playing a more contemporary style like fiddle or something that's a little bit more aggressive, it may need to come in closer to get more of that bite, more of that attack sound. So that's where the sort of artistic aspects of this process come into play. Using earphones. So this is, we'll talk a little bit about using Zoom. Zoom in particular, I was fortunate to be able to work with some friends and former colleagues who are up at Yale University. We were able to get in touch with Zoom over the summer and work with them on adding a mode that enables higher quality audio for music lessons. You have to have an interface or a USB microphone, and you have to wear headphones because it defeats all of the feedback prevention. If you have Zoom, you have the ability to turn on what they call the high fidelity mode. And again, as long as you've got an interface and you're wearing headphones, or you have a USB microphone and headphones, if you turn this on, you'll notice that the person on the other side is going to have a much higher quality than what you would get in the normal settings, which are intended for spoken word and not for music applications. So I'm grateful that that the folks at Zoom are responsive to our concerns and got something in place. I think it was September 1st or very close to that. They knew their deadline of everybody going back to school was going to need that. So that's everything in my presentation, and I am, you can look me up on the Peabody Johns Hopkins website if you're looking for my email address and you have any questions for me. And I imagine somewhere on the festival's website, they'll have my information and a link to these slides when I make them available a little bit later. So that's it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Professor Metcalf, for this presentation. It was very informative and enlightening and very relevant with all of us stuck in our homes and some of us trying to do certain types of recordings using microphones. And I'm sure this has benefited a lot of people. So yes, we will be posting this after the festival, and whatever you send us, the presentation as well as your contact information, we will make sure it gets up on our website. Thank you so much and have a great day.
Excellent. Thank you.
So I stopped the